Sponsored by Rabbi Shlomi and Mirla Greenwald. This is a Sicha from Likutei Sichos, Chelek Gimmel, Parshas Balak, Sicha Alef. And the topic of the Sicha is that in this week's Parsha, we learn the pasuk of Ma Tovu Yaakov Mishkanei Yisrael, and the teachings of Rashi on it. And there are 4 parts in the Sicha. The Rebbe will, number 1, ask 9 questions on Rashi. Number 2, present the key to answering the questions. Number 3, answer the questions. And number 4, present the Hira from this Rashi. On the pasuk in our parsha of Ma Tovu Yaakov Mishkanei Yisrael, where you can see over here the psukim on the side where it appears within the storyline. This is the 3rd time that Bilam came to curse the Yidden and ended up giving them a bracha. So on this pasuk, Rashi explains what's Ma Tovu Elecha, what was good about the oilim of the Yidden. So Rashi explains it's al shara pischayim she'enon mechuvanim zeh mol zeh. It's on this that he saw that the openings of their tents weren't directly across from one another, so that people couldn't look in from one tent into the other. Mishkanei Sicha. What is Mishkanei Sicha? So Rashi explains Chaniyei Sicha. It's your encampments. Kitargumei, like the Targum of Onkelos says. Then Rashi continues and presents a different explanation. Davar acher, another explanation. Ma Tovu elecha. Ma Tovu oil shulai ubeis elamim. How good are the oil of shulai and the Beis Hamikdash b'yeshuvan when they are built. And what's good about them is shemakrivim ben karbanis l'chaper lechem, that you bring karbanis in them in order to atone for yourselves. And how about Mishkanei Sicha? So Rashi explains af kishehin chareven, even when they are destroyed, lefi shehin mashken lechem, because they are security for you. V'churbanim karpara ala nefashos. And what's good about them then is that their destruction is an atonement for the souls. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, Kila Hashem es chamasai, Hashem vented and spent his fury, uvamek kila, and in what did he spend it and end it? Vayotzes eish b'tzion. It's by lighting a fire in Tzion, which is the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. And there are 9 questions here. The first question is on Rashi's explanation of the word Mishkanei Sicha, that it means Chaniyei Sicha, your encampments. The question is, why doesn't Rashi explain Mishkanei Sicha literally, that it's the plural of Mishkan, which is a dwelling, not an encampment? And especially since we don't find anywhere that the singular of Chaniyos, of encampments, would be Mishkan, that the word dwelling is used for that, but rather we say chanais. So if that's the case, that we don't find that the word Mishkanei Sicha or Mishkan refers to Chaniyei Sicha or to chanais, so then why doesn't Rashi just explain it literally, that Mishkanei Sicha means your dwellings and not your encampments? The second question is, from the reading of the pasuk, it's understood that when it says Ma Tovu, it refers both to Oyalecha Yaakov as well as to Mishkanei Sicha Yisrael. And so the question is, when it comes to Oyalecha Yaakov, the Rashi explains to us what was good about Oyalecha Yaakov, that the openings weren't directly across from one another. And the question is, what's good about the Chaniyos of Yidden, the encampments of Yidden? That Rashi doesn't tell us. So what's good about that? The third question is, it's known the rule when it comes to the teachings of Rashi and the Torah, like we said many times, that when Rashi brings 2 or more explanations about a certain matter, the reason is because each one of the explanations has a difficulty that the other one doesn't have. And so the question over here is, what are the difficulties in each pirush, in each explanation of Rashi? And as we'll see later in the Sicha, we also have to explain how the difficulty in the second pirush is greater than the difficulty in the first pirush, and that's why it comes second, because it's not as good of an explanation. The fourth question is, and from this question and on, all the questions will be on the second explanation of Rashi. So questions 1 and 2 were on the first explanation, question 3 was on the need for 2 explanations, and question 4 and on are questions on the second explanation. So the fourth question is, in Rashi's second explanation, he starts off and says Davar Acher, and then he quotes from the pasuk Ma Tovu oyhalecha. And he doesn't just do what he typically does, which is to say Davar Acher, Ma Tovu oyel shilei, which is go straight into the explanation. And so the question is, why does Rashi quote the words Ma Tovu oyhalecha a second time at the beginning of his second explanation? The fifth question is that in the second explanation, Rashi mentions oil shiloi and the Beis Elamim, and it doesn't mention the oil moed that they actually had at that time. The sixth question is regarding the toiv in oil shiloi in the Beis Elamim. So Rashi explains that the toiv is shemakrivim behen karbonis, that we bring karbonis in them. And the question is that l'cha'era Rashi should have said the main toiv that there is in oil shiloi in the Beis Elamim, the way it's written clearly in the pasuk, which is that v'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'seicham, meaning that they are places for Ashras HaShechina. So Rashi should have said that that's the toiv of oil shiloi and Beis Elamim. The seventh question is, why is it important for the understanding of the pasuk to mention that the karbonis are l'chaper aleichem? Why doesn't Rashi just say that the toiv of oil shiloi and the Beis Elamim is shemakrivim ben karbonis? Why does Rashi have to add that the karbonis are l'chaper aleichem? And also regarding the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, why is it important to mention that the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, when it's in the form of a mashkin, a security, it's kapara ala nefashis? Why does Rashi have to mention these two things of l'chaper aleichem and the kapara ala nefashis? And on the other hand, if for the understanding of the mishkan being called a mishkan because it's related to the idea of a mashkin, to a security when it's in the state of destruction, if for understanding that idea, it's important to know that at that time when the Mishkan or the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed, it's a mashkin, it's a security. If it's important for that concept to mention that at that point in time it's a kapara ala nefashos, so how come Rashi doesn't mention this idea at the beginning of Parshas Pekudei? That over there Rashi quotes the words from the pasuk HaMishkan Mishkan, and he says it's written twice because it hints to the Beis Hamikdash that was turned into a security by the 2 times that it was destroyed for the sins of the Yidden. And Rashi doesn't mention over there that it is a kapara ala nefashos, that it's an atonement for the souls. So if it is important, how come Rashi doesn't say it also in Parshas Pekudei? The 8th question is, what's the meaning of being a kapara ala nefashos, an atonement for the souls, which is a very unusual lashon to be used. So what does it even mean? And the 9th question is, since Rashi obviously purposefully says that it's kapara ala nefashos, that the Beis Hamikdash, when it's destroyed, it's a kapara ala nefashos, so the question is, what's the proof for this that Rashi brings, that it's a kapara ala nefashos from the pasuk of Kila Hashem es Chamasai? How does that prove to us that the Beis Hamikdash, when it's destroyed, is a kapara ala nefashos? Now we're going to move on to the key of the Sicha. And the key of the Sicha is to see the pasuk of Ma Tovu elecha Yaakov Mishkan Sicha Yisrael in the context of the other psukim that come before it. And once we see our pasuk in the context of the psukim that come before it, then we'll answer all the questions that we had on Rashi. So the explanation, all of this is as follows. In the introduction to our pasuk of Ma Tovu Gamer, on the words of Vayisa Bilam Eina Vayar Es Yisrael Sheichan L'Shvatov. So Rashi explains, what does Sheichan L'Shvatov mean? It means that Ra Kol Shevet V'Shevet Sheichan La'atzmai Ve'einan Ma'iraven. He saw that each Shevet camped for itself and they weren't mixed together. And Rashi continues, Ra Shein Pischayim Mechuvanim Zeh Keneged Zeh. He saw that their tents were not set up in such a way that the openings were directly across from one another, so that one person shouldn't see into the tent of his fellow. Now, what causes Rashi to explain Sheichan L'Shvatov in this way? What causes Rashi to explain it this way is the simple meaning of Vayar Es Yisrael Sheichan L'Shvatov is that Bilam saw something unique a very special and good anhaga, good conduct of the Yidden, because the reason we have to say this is because this seeing of Vayar es Yisrael Sheichem Lishvatov caused the next words in the pasuk, that Vatihi olav ruach elikim. And Rashi explains, what does it mean, Vatihi olav ruach elikim? It means Allah beliba shalei yikalalim. It came up in his heart not to curse the Yidden. So it must be that he saw something unique that made him feel that he didn't want to curse the Yidden. Now this conduct we see in the pasuk was seen in the way the Yidden were sheichen, because Vayar es Yisrael sheichen l'shvatov, and therefore Rashi explains, what did he see? Ra kol shevet v'shevet sheichen la'atzmai ve'einen me'iraven. He saw that each shevet camped for itself and they didn't mix together, which shows and reflects how the Yidden were extremely careful in regards to yuchsin, to where they belonged. They knew which family each person belonged to. They knew each shevet where each person belonged to. And so this was a matter, as we'll see, related to tznius, that they knew exactly which family they're from, which shevet they're from, and so they knew who they were marrying, and there wasn't a situation of inappropriate mixing. And this yuchsin, Rashi tells us in Parshas Bamidbar, was through Heviu Sifrei Yechusein, the Eideh Cheskes L'Dasim V'chulu. They had documentation and they had witnesses in order to know and prove and show which shevet they belong to, which all of this shows and reflects the greatness of Yidden in regards to tznius. And since Bilam saw this great quality, he was very impressed to the extent that the pasuk says that Vatihi olav ruach elikim, which Rashi says means Allah b'libi shalei kalalim. So that's how we understand that earlier part of the pasuk. However, Rashi says an additional thing. He says that also Rashi pischeim mechuvanim zeh keneged zeh. So the reason Rashi says this is because, however, according to what we just said, it should have said in the pasuk Vayar Yisrael Sheichen Lishvatim, not Lishvatov, because Shvatim indicates that the Shvatim weren't mixed together. And since it says in the pasuk Lishvatov, so this proves that Bilam saw another great quality in Yidden that's reflected in Lishvatov, that within each shevet it was recognizable that it's a shevet of Yidden. And Rashi explains, what did Bilam see within each shevet? That Bilam also saw, in addition to how the Yidden camped separately, each shevet for itself, he also saw she'ein pischeim mechuvanim zeh keneged zeh. He saw that their openings of their tents weren't directly across from one another, so that one person shouldn't see into the tent of his fellow. And it's understood that also this quality caused that Vatihi olav ruach elikim, which is that Allah b'liba shalei kalalim. It came up in his heart not to curse the Yidden because of this quality as well. And fitting with this introduction, once we have this background, so Rashi explains the continuation of the psukim, that when Bilam then went on to speak good about the Yidden, so Bilam explains after his opening, the beginning we see, it says in the pasuk, Vayisa Bilam Esainav, Vayar Yisrael Sheichen Lishvatov, and as a result of what he saw, Vatihi olav ruach elikim, it came up in his heart not to curse them. And then it says in the pasuk, Vayisa Meshaloi, that Bilam began talking, Vayemar Nu'um Bilam b'nei Ba'er, U'Nu'um Hagever Shesuma Ha'ayin, Nu'um Shemea Imer Kel, Asher Machzei Shaka Yechze Neufel Ugluye Noyim. So he's saying an introduction of who's speaking. And then right away he said at the beginning of his actual talking, Ma Tovu Elecha Yaakov Mishkan Sicha Yisrael. So after his opening of Nu'um Bilam b'nei Ba'er v'Gamer until Ugluye Noyim, so Bilam explains the reason that he isn't cursing them, because of these two good qualities of Yidden. Number one, Ma Tovu Elecha Yaakov, because of the way the tents stand, and Mishkan Sicha Yisrael, the way the Shvatim camped. And that's why Bilam said, Ma Tovu Gamer, which, when we look at it simply, it isn't the wording of a bracha. He's not giving them a bracha, and he's not either saying an avua, but rather it's an expression of being inspired by the good things that he saw, which is the reason he isn't cursing the Yidden. And not only is he not cursing them, he's actually speaking of their praise and giving them a bracha. And based on this understanding of our pasuk, we're going to see how it's going to lead into answering all of the questions on Rashi. And this key to the Sicha leads into answering all the questions, and we're going to begin by answering questions number 1 and 2, which were both questions on the first explanation of Rashi. The first question was, how come Rashi explains Mishkanei Sicha to mean Chaniyei Sicha, your encampments, and not to mean your dwellings, which is the more simple translation of a Mishkan. And question number 2 was, Rashi doesn't say what's good about the Chanias of the Yidden, about the encampments. Rashi doesn't say what's good about it, so what is it that's good about them? Based on everything we said, that this pasuk comes in continuation and in the context of the earlier pasuk of Vayisa Bilamus Einov Vayaris Yisrael Sheikh and Lishvatov, the two things that Rashi says that he saw. So this is why Rashi explains over here that Ma Tovu Elecha is al Shara Pischem She'enim Mechuvanim Zemol Zeh. Ma Tovu Elecha refers to this, that he saw that the openings of the tents weren't directly across from one another, and Mishkan Secha means Chaniyei Secha, and not like the regular meaning of Mishkan and Dira, that Mishkan Secha would mean a dwelling, a Dira, a place of living, because it's the second good quality that Bilam saw, that Kol Shevet V'Shevet Sheichem La'atzmai, that each Shevet is for itself. Bilam saw two things. So Ma Tovu Elecha is one of the good things that he saw, that the openings of the tents weren't directly across from one another. And Mishkan Secha has to be the second good thing that he saw, which is that Kol Shevet V'Shevet Sheichem La'atzmai, that each Shevet was camped and living by itself, separate from the other Shevet, from the other Shvatim. And so Rashi explains it this way so that it should fit with what's said earlier. And since this isn't the regular explanation of Mishkan Secha, which usually means a dwelling, a Mishkan, a Dira, so therefore Rashi adds Kitar Gumay, that the Targum says over here on Mishkan Secha, he says Meishrach, which is the Targum of Chaniya in several places. So we see that Mishkan Secha can mean Chaniyei Secha, because the Targum says Mishkan Secha Meishrach, and Meishrach is the Targum of the word Chaniya. So Mishkan Secha over here can mean Chaniyei Secha, and Rashi brings that proof from the Targum. And the reason is because our pasuk comes in continuation to that earlier pasuk of what Bilam saw. And here Bilam's giving the reason that he's going to give the Yidden a bracha and not a klala. So he's giving the reasons. It has to fit with the reasons that Rashi said earlier that caused Bilam not to want to curse the Yidden. Now we're going to move on to answer part of question 3. Question 3 was, what are the difficulties in each explanation of Rashi, that therefore Rashi has to bring two explanations. So now we're going to point out the difficulties in the first explanation of Rashi. However, there are difficulties with this explanation of Rashi. Number 1, we don't find anywhere else that Mishkan means Chaniyah. So this is out of the ordinary, that we're translating Mishkan Secha to mean Chaniyei Secha. Number 2, the camping of the Shvatim is more general. The way they camped is more general, and also comes first in time. First they camp separately, so that's more general, and it's earlier in time to the detail of the tents of each Shevet, that the openings weren't across from one another. So the general thing is that they camped separately, each Shevet for itself, and then a detail is within each camping of each individual Shevet, the openings weren't directly across from one another. So that should be the order in the pasuk, but here it's reversed. First it says Ma Tovu Elecha, which refers to the openings of the tents, and then it says Mishkan Secha, which is their encampments. To add to this, the third difficulty is Kol Shevet V'Shevet Sheichem La'atzmai Ve'einen Mu'iraven. This point that each Shevet's for itself and they're not mixed is the main point and is much greater. That idea of tznius, that each shevet's for itself, and people knew which family and which shevet they belonged to, and therefore, when it came to the marriages, they knew that they were marrying in an appropriate way. So it's much greater, and it's the main point, as opposed to that she'ein pischei mechuvanim zeh keneged zeh, which is secondary. It's a much more minor degree and idea in tznius, to avoid looking into another tent, and so it should be first. And in the pasuk, it first speaks about Oyalecha, that the tents, the openings weren't across from one another, and only afterwards it talks about Mishkan Secha. And number 4, according to this, so then Ma Tovu Gamer isn't a nevuah. It's just a reason that Bilam is giving. And if that's the case, it should therefore be before the pasuk of Ne'um Shemea Imrei Kel Gamer. When we see what it says over here, in the Psukim, it says Vayisa Meshala Vayemar Ne'um Bilam B'nei Ba'er or Ne'um Hagever Shesum Ha'ayin. Right there it should have said Ma Tovu Elecha Yaakov Mishkan Secha Yisrael. And only afterwards it should say Ne'um Shemea Imrei Kel, which means he's going to start saying a nevuah. This is not a nevuah. Ma Tovu Elecha Yaakov Mishkan Secha Yisrael is the reason he's not going to curse the Yidden, and he's going to give them a bracha. So then it should be written before Bilam said that he's going to say the words of a nevuah. Even though we could say that the reason it's written afterwards, this is mentioned, the way to answer this question, the reason Ma Tovu is written afterwards is because he wants to finish the introduction. He said, Vayemar, Bilam said, Nu'um Bilam b'nei ba'ar, or Nu'um agever shesamayin. So he continued, Nu'um shemeh imrei kel. So it's possible to answer that, but still it would have been better for the pasuk Ma Tovu elecha Yaakov to be written before Bilam says that he's going to say a nevuah. Now we're going to move on to answer questions 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, which are the remaining questions. And the only thing we still have to get to is the other part of question 3 to explain what's the difficulty in the second explanation. So let's go straight into answering all those other questions. So therefore, because of these difficulties with the first explanation, so Rashi presents a second explanation, and such an explanation that refers to a nevuah of the future. Because that's the difficulty, that it should be a nevuah, because it's said by Bilam after Bilam said Nu'um Shemea Imrei Kel. So Rashi says it's a nevuah of the future. So that already answers question number 5. Why doesn't Rashi say that it refers, when it says Oyalecha, refers to the Oyel Moed, which they actually had, because this is a nevuah of the future. And what is it? Ma Tovu Oyel Shilei uBeisei Lamin b'Yeshuvan. Ma Tovu Oyalecha refers to Oyel Shilei and the Beisei Lamin when they are built, because it's understood very simply that there is something especially good in the Mikdashais, so it fits with Ma Tovu. And since it says the lashon of oil, so this indicates that it's referring to oil shilei. And since it says oil lech on the plural, it indicates that it also includes another thing that is similar to oil shilei, and that is the Beis Elamim, the Beis Mikdash. And Mishkan Sicha Yisrael also refers to the Mikdashais, and it's referring to them when they are destroyed, and that's why they are referred to as Mishkan Sicha, as in a mashkin, a security which is taken. And even though it's self-understood what's good in Oyel Shilei in the Beis Elamim, like we said, it's the V'shachanti B'seichem, there's obviously something very good in Oyel Shilei and Beis Elamim, but nevertheless, and here we're going to answer questions number 6, 7, and 8, which is, why does Rashi not just say the Toiv is the V'shachanti B'seichem, and why does Rashi say after Makrivim Karbonos, he says l'chaper aleichem, and how come he says about the mashkin that it's kapara al nefashos, and what's the meaning of kapara al nefashos? So even though it's self-understood what's good in the Oyel Shilei and the Beis Elamim, nevertheless, we explained earlier that this pasuk, which begins with Ma Tovu Gamer, it's a sort of a reason for why Bilam isn't cursing the Yidden, and that we're going to say also according to this explanation. And therefore Rashi adds Shemakrivim ben Karbonos, and also v'churbanim kapara ala nefashos, because that's an explanation for why Bilam is not cursing Yidden. Why is that an explanation? So the explanation for this is the preparation of Bilam this time when he came to curse the Yidden was, like it says in the pasuk we had earlier, all the psukim. It says Vayar Bilam ki toiv be'enei Hashem levarchis Yisrael. So it says V'lo yeholach kepam bepam lekras nechashim. And as Rashi explains, Bilam said, Askir Aveniseim, I'm going to mention their sins, Va'klala ala skars Aveniseim tachel, and then the curse for mentioning their sins is going to take effect. And therefore afterwards, when Bilam gave the Yidden a bracha, he had to explain that the curse wouldn't be able to take effect because of the Yidden's sins. And that's why we must say that the greatness of Vayalecha is Shemakrivim ben Karbonos lechaper aleichem. That's why Rashi chooses to say Shemakrivim ben Karbonos, and not that Hashem is there. And that's why he also adds lechaper aleichem, because it's about a kapara for the Yidden's averis, and therefore the averis cannot harm the Yidden. However, this still isn't enough. Why? Because this is only when the Beis Hamikdash exists, not when the Beis Hamikdash is not around. And even then, the Karbanos only atone either for a shaygig be'isr karas, specifically a shaygig by isr karas, or a mazid, but then only be'isr asay, and also some various lavin. But it's not a kapara for a mazid be'isr karas and a mazid by a isr which has Mrs. Bezdin. And so the curse can take effect for those averis. So how is this an explanation for why he can't curse them? He could curse them for those averis. Therefore Rashi adds v'churbanon kapara ala nefashos, which this fits with Rashi's pirush about the 250 people by Machlekes Korach. He says, "Achatayim me'ela benafsheisam." Says Rashi, what's benafsheisam? Shenasu poishim benafsheisam shenechleku al Kadosh Baruch Hu. the nafshesim refers that they went against Hashem, which is the greatest pshia. And we're saying that the churban of the Beis Hamikdash is a kapara even for the most terrible thing. And so therefore, even though the karbanos don't bring a kapara for Mazid, Be'isr Karas, or Mrs. Bezdin, but the churban of the Beis Hamikdash does. Another explanation for the word bina v'churban and kapara al hanefashes. We can also say that Rashi's intent of hanefashes in the plural is that it's a kapara for nefashis, for the nefesh kisechta b'shgaga, for the nefesh that doesn't have error by mistake, and for the nefesh asher tasa b'yad rama, the nefesh that does it on purpose. The churban's a kapara both for shegig and also for mazid. So this answers questions number 6, 7, and 8. Why Rashi doesn't say v'shachanti b'seicham, but rather he says that they bring karbanos. Why Rashi adds l'chaper aleichem and kapara al hanefashes, because that relates that to going against Bilam's intent that he's going to mention the Averis. So he's saying that there's a kapara, and that's why he says kapara al hanefashes, because that brings out that the kapara is complete. And now we're going to move on to answer question number 9 about how is the pasuk of Kila Hashem es Chamasei a proof for kapara al hanefashes. And Rashi brings a proof that churbanim are a kapara al hanefashes from Kila Hashem es Chamasei. That through Vayatzas Eish B'Tzion, through making a fire in Tzion, destroying the Beis Hamikdash, the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, the anger of Hashem, what's the anger of Hashem that's caused by the sins of the Yidden, was completely spent. It says, Kil Hashem es Chamasei. Hashem's anger was spent. This anger came from the Yidden's Averis, and that anger was spent. So we see that it's completely gone, because if it's not completely gone, then you can't say Kila. So we see that through the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, all the sins of the Yidden were forgiven. Because if they weren't all forgiven, then it wouldn't be Kila Hashem es Chamasei, that the anger of Hashem that comes through Averis is spent. It's not spent because it's not fully forgiven. It must be that it is fully forgiven. So that's why this is a proof to bring out that there's complete forgiveness, which is the idea of Churbanan ala nefashis, Kapara ala nefashis, which we said nefashis means the worst of Averis, that everything, even the worst ones, are forgiven. Now we're going to move on to answer question number 4, which was, why does Rashi quote at the beginning of his second explanation? He says, Davar acher, Ma Tovu elecha. Why does he say the words Ma Tovu elecha? And then he says, Ma Tovu, he goes into the explanation. Why does he quote the words Ma Tovu elecha again from the pasuk? And according to this, it's understood, or Rashi repeats the words Ma Tovu elecha. It's in order to emphasize that these words of Bilam are a reason for why Bilam was unable to curse the Yidden. And that's what forces the explanation that the good of Vayalecha and Mishkan Sicha is Shemakrivim ben Karbanis L'chaper Aleichem, and also that Karban and Kapara al Nefashas. So Rashi quotes the words Ma Tovu Elecha again in order to emphasize we have these words Ma Tovu Elecha, which indicate that he's giving a reason here. And since he's giving a reason, so he must give a reason that's going to address what his original intention was, to use the Yidden's Averis as the way to bring about a curse. So therefore, since Ma Tovu Elecha, the wording of Ma Tovu Elecha expresses that he's explaining why he's giving them the bracha. It's a reason why he's able to give it to them. And the curse is not going to take effect. So therefore, that's why Rashi has to explain that the oil shiloi and the Beis Hamikdash and their churban are related to a kapara, and therefore there can't be a curse. And now we're going to move on to answering something we asked in question 7. How come Rashi doesn't say about the kapara in Parshas Pekudei? And according to this, it's also understood that this explanation doesn't belong in Parshas Pekudei, because the pasuk is over there is only coming to hint to the two mikdashos that they exist, and it's not relevant to explain their greatness. That has nothing to do with the psukim over there. Whereas over here, it's directly related to their greatness, because it's their greatness that is the reason that the curse can take effect. Now we're going to move on to answer the other part of question 3, which is, what is the difficulty in the second explanation? And not only does it also have a difficulty, in what way is the difficulty in the second explanation greater than the difficulty in the first explanation, which as a result, it's brought as the second explanation and not the first and better explanation. So, however, also according to this explanation, it's also difficult. And there are two difficulties. Number one, it's difficult to say that the Beis Elamim, which is permanent, should be referred to as a oil, which is temporary. Because we're saying that when it says Ma Tovu Oyelecha Yaakov, it refers to the Mishkan Shiloi and the Beis Elamim. So the word Oyelecha, or oil, is being used to refer to Beis Elamim, which doesn't fit. And number two, the second difficulty is it's explained in the Sicha and Chelek Alef about the teaching of Rashi in Parshas Pekudei, that the reason Rashi doesn't say that Mishkan two times refers to Mishkan Shili and the Beis Hamikdash, but rather it refers to the two Mikdashes. Why does Rashi say it refers to the two Mikdashes and not to Mishkan Shili and the Beis Hamikdash? It's because Mishkan Shili cannot be called a mashkan. A mashkan is something which is being taken away and will be returned. So we could say that about the two Batei Mikdash, but we cannot say that about Mishkan Shili, that it was taken away and will be returned. And so therefore, it's a problem over here as well to say that when it says Mishkan Sicha and it means a mashkan, it refers to the time of the destruction of Mishkan Shili, that Mishkan Shili is being called a mashkan. And so, therefore, because of these difficulties, Rashi also needs the first explanation, and even more so. It's actually the better of the two explanations, and is closer to Pshuta Shemikra, and that's why it comes first. In what way is the first explanation better? Because according to the first explanation, the main difficulties we mentioned is in regards to the order of the pasuk, that the pasuk is not in a good order, that it speaks about Eilecha before Mishkan Sicha. It talks about the oilim not being, the openings of the oilim not being directly across from one another before talking about the way the Shvatim camped. So the order is not good. And we can say, Saras HaMikra V'Dersheu, like we often say, just turn the pasuk around. Whereas according to the second explanation, the difficulty is in the content of the explanation of the pasuk. That we're saying that the word oil refers to Beis Elamim. And we're saying the word Mishkan Sicha, which is Mashkin, refers to Mishkan Shili. And because the difficulties on the second explanation are greater, therefore Rashi also brings the first explanation, and he brings the first explanation first. The hira from this teaching of Rashi is, from the teaching of Rashi, we see how great and important sneas is. That even the detail of she'im pischei mechuvanim zeh keneged zeh, that the openings of their tents weren't directly across from one another, which seems not to be such a fundamental aspect of sneas, since it's only in order shaliyatzis l'sei chayil chaver, that a person shouldn't see inside the tent of their fellow. Even that detail has the power to affect that even Bilam Rasha, it came up in his heart not to curse the Yidden because of this, to the extent that he gave the Yidden a bracha. The error from this is a person shouldn't say that they will be careful by a great and major aspect of tznius, like for example, kol shevet sheichem la'atzmei ve'einem meravin, that each person knows their family that they belong to. But there's no need to be so careful by a light aspect of tznius. A person must know that also this detail is a major aspect of tznius, to the extent that it has the power to transform every negative matter from one extreme to the other extreme. And still the Yetzer Hara can say, when is this the case? Only regards to something permanent. But when it's something temporary, so then it's not necessary to be so careful with tznius. And also in the lighter aspects, a person doesn't have to be careful with tznius in general, and also a person doesn't have to be careful in the lighter aspects, like with the more severe aspects. So here too is the Eirah, that it was Ra Shein Pischei Mechuvanim Zeh Keneged Zeh. It was even when they were in their tents, which is a temporary dwelling. And here there's a ha'ara, a footnote in the Sicha, where the footnote, usually the text in the footnote is smaller than the text in the Sicha. Here the text in the footnote is even bigger than the text in the Sicha, and it's bold. Where the Rebbe mentions that now is the place to emphasize and point out regarding something which is relevant to the time, because it's summertime, about those that are lenient about a number of matters of tznius in the summer, and especially when they find themselves in a temporary place outside of the city, and among them there are those who say, Echt v'ashuv, I'll sin and then I'll do tshuva. And the play on the words is, Echt, I'll sin v'ashuv, and I'll do tshuva, kasher ashuv ha'ira, when I come back to the city. And the Rebbe points out that this is relevant for the conduct of men as well, and it's especially for women, because each and every woman, they are the akaras habayis, they're the foundation of the home. And the Rebbe concludes, the veish laharich, there's what to speak more about it, ve'in kama kaimei. And the Sicha concludes, and on the other hand, when the conduct isn't a matter of Ma Tovu lecha Yaakov mishkan Sicha Yisrael, then it's like it says in Chumash Dvarim, v'lei ava Hashem lekecha l'shmoyel bilam v'yafach Hashem lekecha l'chogemer, that Hashem did not want to listen to Bilam, and Hashem changed the curse into a bracha. And like Rashi says on the next pasuk here, that Haya b'libay chulu, Bilam had in mind to curse the Yidden. When Hashem switched it, He gave them a bracha. So this is to the prophecy of what we have, Ma Tovu lecha Yaakov, which we said refers to the Mishkan Atev, B'Shleimus, having the Mishkan in its completion in its wholeness, that Hashem will return the mashkin, which is the Beis Elamim. That when we say a mashkin, it indicates that even when it's destroyed, it still exists. And when the kapara is complete, so this mashkin will come down and be revealed, and it'll be la'ad ula'ilmei elamim, forever and ever.